The flames licked hungrily at the night sky, painting the Utah mountains in an eerie orange glow as Jillian Caldwell's desperate screams pierced through the crackling inferno. It was 1878 in Alta, a small mining settlement nestled high in the Wasatch Mountains, and what had begun as a peaceful evening had transformed into a nightmare of fire and fear. Her prized Morgan horses whinnied in terror, trapped in their stalls as the barn's wooden structure surrendered to the relentless blaze. Blake Jamison had been riding back to town after a long day driving cattle when he spotted the flames from nearly a mile away. Something in his chest tightened as he recognized the location, the Caldwell place, where the stubborn, beautiful woman who'd rebuffed his advances for months lived alone since her father's passing. Without hesitation, he dug his heels into his stallion's flanks, urging the animal to a gallop as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Help!" Jillian cried, her voice growing hoarse from the smoke as she stood helplessly before the burning structure. She'd managed to lead 2 of her horses to safety before a falling beam had blocked the entrance, trapping the remaining 3 inside. The animal's frightened whinnies tore at her heart as surely as the flames tore through the dry timber of the barn. Blake arrived in a cloud of dust, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. "Jillian," he called out, his deep voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "Stand back, Blake." Jillian turned, momentarily stunned to see the tall cowboy who'd been attempting to court her since his arrival in Alta 6 months prior. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled from the hard ride, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "My horses are still inside. I'll get them," he said, already stripping off his leather coat and dousing a bandana in the water trough. He tied the wet cloth around his face before meeting her tear-filled eyes. "Stay here." "No, it's too dangerous," she protested, grabbing his arm. The roof could collapse any minute. Blake gently removed her hand, giving it a quick squeeze. "I'm not leaving those animals to die," he said, and before she could argue further, he was running toward the barn, disappearing into the smoke and flames. Jillian held her breath, her heart seeming to stop as the seconds stretched into an eternity. The crackling of the fire grew louder, and a terrible groaning sound came from the roof beams. "Blake!" she screamed, taking an involuntary step forward. Just as the first section of roof caved in with a thunderous crash, Blake emerged from the inferno, leading 2 terrified horses by their halters. His face was streaked with soot, his shirt singed in places, but his expression was grimly determined. "Take them," he gasped, thrusting the reins into her trembling hands before turning back toward the barn. "No," Jillian cried, but he was already gone, vanishing once more into the hellish glow. The next minutes were the longest of Jillian's life as she secured the rescued horses to a fence post and watched the barn continue to crumble. Just when she was certain Blake had been lost to the flames, a shadowy figure staggered from the doorway, leading her prized stallion, Thunder. The horse was wild-eyed with fear, but Blake's firm hand on his halter kept the animal from bolting. Relief flooded through Jillian as she rushed forward to take the horse, but her relief turned to horror as Blake collapsed to his knees, coughing violently. "Blake!" she cried, dropping to the ground beside him. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, still coughing. "Just smoke," he managed, his voice raspy. "Had to get them all." Tears streamed down Jillian's face as she helped him to his feet. "You could have been killed," she scolded, though her voice held no real anger, only concern and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Couldn't let you lose them," Blake replied, his breathing slowly returning to normal as they moved away from the heat of the fire. "I know what they mean to you. As they stood together watching the barn collapse completely, Jillian realized something had shifted between them. The stubborn cowboy who had irritated her with his persistent attention had just risked his life for what mattered to her. She glanced at his soot-covered profile, seeing him truly for the first time, and felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or smoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand finding his in the darkness. Blake turned to her, his blue eyes serious in his blackened face. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat, Jillian," he said simply, and she knew with absolute certainty that he meant it. The fire continued to burn, but something else had ignited that night, something that would prove far more difficult to extinguish. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the September air carrying the first hint of the brutal mountain winter to come. Jillian awoke in her small cabin, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous night came rushing back. The barn, her father's pride, was gone, reduced to smoldering ruins. But her horses were safe, thanks to Blake Jamison. She rose and dressed quickly, her muscles protesting from the exertion and stress of the night before. Through the window, she could see the blackened skeleton of the barn silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky. With a heavy sigh, she braided her chestnut hair and pinned it at the nape of her neck, then splashed cold water on her face from the basin. A knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found Blake standing on her porch, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up since the fire, but a red mark along his jawline and a small bandage on his forearm attested to his ordeal. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough from the smoke. "Thought I'd check on you and the horses." Jillian stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. "Come in. I was just about to make coffee." She busied herself with the stove, oddly self-conscious under his watchful gaze. The horses seemed fine, a bit skittish, but no burns or injuries. Blake nodded, settling his tall frame into a chair at her small table. "Good. That's good." He cleared his throat. "I brought some of the men from the Silver Star. We can help you clear the debris and start rebuilding before winter sets in." Jillian turned to face him, coffee pot in hand. "Why would you do that?" "Because you need help," he replied simply. "And that's what neighbors do." She studied him for a moment. Blake Jamison had arrived in Alta 6 months ago, taking a job as foreman at the Silver Star Ranch. From their first meeting, he'd made his interest in her clear, bringing her wildflowers, offering to help with chores, inviting her to the town's social gatherings. She'd rebuffed him consistently, partly out of grief for her recently deceased father and partly out of determination to prove she could manage the small horse breeding operation on her own. But now, looking at the sincerity in his eyes, she felt her defenses beginning to crumble. "I can't pay you," she said finally, pouring the coffee. "I'm not asking for payment. I don't like being beholden to anyone." Blake accepted the cup she offered, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Then consider it a debt I'm repaying. Your father sold me my first horse when I was just a boy passing through with my pa. He gave me a fair price when others would have cheated a child. I never forgot that." Surprise flickered across Jillian's face. "You knew my father before," Blake nodded, sipping the strong coffee. 15 years ago. We were heading to California, but the horse my pa had bought in Denver went lame. We stopped here, and your father sold us a sturdy paint that got us all the way to Sacramento." He smiled at the memory. "I was just 10, but I remember thinking your father was what a real horseman should be." Jillian felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I didn't know. I recognized the Caldwell brand when I took the job at Silver Star. When I heard Thomas Caldwell's daughter was running the place alone after his passing, I wanted to meet you." His blue eyes met hers directly. "I wanted to see if you were like him." "And am I?" she asked softly. "You're every bit as stubborn," Blake said with a grin. and every bit as good with horses. He'd be proud. The compliment warmed her more than she cared to admit. She took a seat across from him, cradling her coffee cup. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Blake shrugged. "You seemed determined to keep me at arm's length." "I figured I'd earn your respect first, then maybe share the connection." Jillian felt a flush of shame at how coolly she'd treated him. "I'm sorry if I've been unkind." "You haven't been unkind, just cautious. I understand that." He set his cup down. "But after last night, I'm hoping maybe we could start fresh. As friends, at least." Friends. The word hung between them, and Jillian found herself wondering if friendship was truly all she wanted from this man who'd braved fire to save what mattered to her. "I'd like that," she said finally, extending her hand across the table. Blake took it, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Then it's settled. Friends." But as their hands remained clasped a moment longer than necessary, both knew that friends might be just the beginning. The men from Silver Star arrived mid-morning, a dozen cowboys on horseback led by the ranch owner, Edward Mitchell. They brought tools, lumber, and willing hands, setting to work clearing the charred remains of the barn with cheerful efficiency. Blake organized them into teams, his natural leadership evident in the way they responded to his quiet directions. Jillian worked alongside them, refusing to be a helpless bystander. By midday, her hands were blistered and her back ached, but a significant portion of the debris had been cleared away. She was stacking salvaged nails when Edward approached. "Miss Caldwell," he greeted her, removing his hat. He was an older man, his hair and beard more salt than pepper, but his eyes were kind beneath bushy brows. "A word, if I might," she straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Of course, Mr. Mitchell. I understand you've been breeding and training horses since your father's passing." Jillian nodded cautiously. "That's right. It's a small operation, but the Caldwell bloodlines are strong." "Indeed they are. In fact, that's what I wanted to discuss." He gestured toward where her 5 horses grazed in the paddock, including the 3 Blake had rescued. "The Silver Star is looking to improve its stock. We'd be interested in purchasing breeding rights to your stallion, Thunder." Jillian's eyebrows rose in surprise. The Silver Star was the largest ranch in the area, with hundreds of horses. That Edward Mitchell would seek out her modestly sized operation was unexpected. "That's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but Thunder is young yet, only just proven as a sire." Mitchell smiled. "Blake speaks highly of your eye for horseflesh. If you say the colt has promise, that's good enough for me." He named a figure that made Jillian's eyes widen. "Plus, we'd provide grazing for your mares on Silver Star land until your barn is rebuilt." It was an exceptionally fair offer, more than fair. Jillian glanced toward Blake, who was directing men as they sorted through lumber. "Had he orchestrated this? I'll need to consider it," she said finally. "Of course," Mitchell replied easily. "No rush, but the offer stands." He settled his hat back on his head. "You've made quite an impression on my foreman, Miss Caldwell. Blake's not a man easily impressed." Before she could respond to that loaded statement, Mitchell tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Jillian to wonder exactly what Blake had said about her. She found out that evening as the workers were packing up to return to Silver Star. Blake approached as she was securing the temporary corral they'd constructed for the horses. "Mitchell made you an offer," he said, leaning against the fence. "It wasn't a question." Jillian nodded, checking the gate latch. "He did. A very generous one. Thunder's worth it. He has excellent conformation and a good temperament." She turned to face him, arms crossed. "And you had nothing to do with this sudden interest in my breeding stock." Blake had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I might have mentioned that Silver Star's line could use some of the Caldwell speed and endurance." "I don't need charity, Blake. His expression grew serious. "It's not charity, Jillian. It's business. Good business for both you and Silver Star." He stepped closer, his height forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I know you're proud. So am I. But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely, especially when it benefits everyone involved." Jillian sighed, knowing he was right but still uncomfortable with the feeling of dependency. "I'll think about it." Blake nodded, then gestured toward the cleared area where the barn had stood. The foundation was already taking shape, the men having worked tirelessly throughout the day. "We'll be back tomorrow to continue. Should have the frame up by the end of the week if the weather holds." "Thank you," Jillian said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Something warm flickered in Blake's eyes. "You'd have managed." "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." He hesitated, then added, "But you don't have to do everything alone, Jillian." She looked away, uncomfortable with the insight he seemed to have into her heart. Since her father's death 18 months ago, she'd been determined to prove to herself as much as to the skeptical townsfolk that she could maintain the Caldwell breeding program alone. That determination had become a wall between her and others, a barrier of pride that few had tried to breach. Until Blake, "Would you stay for supper?" she found herself asking. "It's just stew, but there's plenty." A smile spread across his face, transforming his rugged features. "I'd like that." Over a simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread they talked, really talked for perhaps the first time. Blake told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a restless father who moved the family every few years in search of opportunity. He spoke of working cattle drives in Texas, mining silver in Nevada, and eventually finding his way back to Utah. "What made you come back here?" Jillian asked, refilling his coffee cup. Blake considered the question, absently running a finger around the rim of his cup. "I never forgot this place. The mountains, the air, the feeling of being somewhere. Solid." He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "When I heard Mitchell needed a new foreman, it felt like an opportunity to put down roots." "And have you? Put down roots, I mean." "I'm working on it," he replied, his gaze so intent that she felt heat rise in her cheeks. To divert the conversation from dangerous waters, she asked about his family. "My pa passed 5 years back, pneumonia. Ma's still in Missouri with my youngest sister, Elizabeth. My brother John has a farm there too." He smiled fondly. "They write regular, asking when I'm coming home." "And what do you tell them? That I am home, or getting there?" He paused, then asked, "What about you? Any family besides your father?" Jillian shook her head. "My mother died when I was 4, consumption. It was just Pa and me after that." She stared into her coffee, remembering. "He taught me everything: how to ride, how to judge a horse's conformation, how to negotiate a sale. People thought he was wrong to raise me more like a son than a daughter, but he just said I had to be prepared for anything." "He was right," Blake said softly, "and he did well by you." They talked until the fire burned low, sharing stories and slowly dismantling the walls between them. When Blake finally rose to leave, Jillian walked him to the door, a curious reluctance slowing her steps. "Thank you for supper," he said, settling his hat on his head. "And for the company." "Thank you for saving my horses," she replied. "And for bringing the men to help rebuild." They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodnight. Finally, Blake reached out slowly, as if she were a skittish colt, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. The gentle touch sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Good night, Jillian," he said, his voice deeper than usual. "Good night, Blake." She watched from the doorway as he mounted his horse and rode into the darkness, her fingers unconsciously touching the spot on her cheek where his hand had been. Over the next 2 weeks, the new barn took shape with remarkable speed. True to his word, Blake brought men from Silver Star each day, and neighbors from nearby homesteads pitched in as well. Jillian worked alongside them all, her hands growing calloused, her skin tanned from the October sun. More surprising than the physical transformation of her property was the change in her relationship with Blake. Each evening after the other workers left, he stayed to share a meal and conversation. They established a comfortable rhythm, with Blake telling stories of his travels and Jillian sharing memories of growing up in the mountain town. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. One evening, as they sat on her porch enjoying the cool air, Blake said casually, "Mitchell's having a harvest dance at Silver Star on Saturday. The whole town's invited." Jillian looked over at him, noting the careful nonchalance of his tone. "Is that so? MMM." He kept his eyes on the darkening mountains. "Thought you might like to attend. With me." She felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with trepidation. A public outing together would signal something to the townspeople, something she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. "I don't have anything suitable to wear," she said, stalling. Blake turned to her then, amusement glinting in his eyes. "Is that your only objection?" Jillian sighed, caught in her transparent excuse. "No," she admitted. "I'm not much for social gatherings. I always feel out of place." "Because you'd rather be with horses than people," he suggested gently. She nodded, surprised by his understanding. "Horses are simpler. They don't judge or gossip or expect you to be something you're not. True enough." Blake stretched his long legs out in front of him. "But people have their good points too. Music for one, dancing for another." He cast her a sidelong glance. "Do you dance, Jillian Caldwell?" "My father taught me," she admitted, "but it's been years." "Like riding a horse," Blake said with a smile. "Once learned, never forgotten." She laughed despite herself. "You certainly have a one-track mind." "Is that a yes?" Jillian hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll go to the dance with you." Blake's smile was worth the moment of uncertainty. "Good," he said simply, but his eyes held a warmth that made her heart beat faster. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a crispness in the air that promised frost by morning. Jillian spent the day in an unusual state of nervous anticipation, checking on the horses more times than necessary and rearranging items in the cabin that didn't need rearranging. At midday, a knock at the door revealed Sarah Jenkins, the wife of the local blacksmith and one of the few women in Alta who had made friendly overtures to Jillian after her father's death. "I heard Blake Jamison is escorting you to the dance," Sarah said without preamble, her round face bright with curiosity. At 40, with 5 children and 15 years of marriage behind her, Sarah considered herself something of a matchmaker. Jillian stepped back to let her in. "News travels fast." "It's a small town," Sarah replied cheerfully, setting a wrapped bundle on the table. "And that cowboy has been sweet on you since he arrived. Half the women in Alta have set their caps for him, but he's only had eyes for you." Heat rose in Jillian's cheeks. "We're friends," she said, though the word felt inadequate for what had been growing between them. Sarah's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Well, friends or not, I thought you might like to borrow this." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a dress of deep green cotton, simply cut but far more fashionable than Jillian's practical skirts and shirtwaists. "Oh, Sarah, I couldn't. Nonsense. It's just gathering dust in my trunk. I was saving it for when Betsy gets older, but that's years away yet." Sarah held the dress up against Jillian's tall frame. "We're of a height, though you're slimmer. Nothing a few pins can't fix." Overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness, Jillian felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Sarah squeezed her hand. "It's good to see you stepping out again, Jillian. Your pa wouldn't want you to spend your life alone." Later, as Jillian fastened the last button on the borrowed dress, she had to admit that Sarah had been right. The green fabric complemented her auburn hair and brought out the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. She'd left her hair loose, the waves falling past her shoulders in a way that made her look younger than her 23 years. As she was pinning a simple cameo at her throat, her mother's, one of the few possessions she had of the woman she barely remembered, another knock came at the door. Her heart jumped, knowing it would be Blake. She opened the door to find him standing on her porch, and for a moment, neither spoke. Blake was dressed in his best, a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and clean denims. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a rebellious lock fell across his forehead, and he'd clearly just shaved. In his hand he held a small bunch of wild asters, their purple blooms bright against his tanned skin. "You look beautiful," he said finally, his voice lower than usual. Jillian flushed with pleasure. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself, Cowboy," he grinned, handing her the flowers. "These pale next to you, but I thought you might like them." She accepted them with a smile, touched by the gesture. "Let me put them in water, then we can go." As she arranged the flowers in a jar, she was acutely aware of Blake's presence in her small cabin. He seemed to fill the space, not just physically but with a kind of quiet energy that made the familiar room feel different, charged somehow. "Ready?" he asked when she'd placed the asters on the table. She nodded, suddenly shy as he offered his arm. His forearm was solid beneath her fingers as they walked to where his horse waited. With practiced ease, he lifted her onto the saddle, then swung up behind her. The arrangement necessitated a closeness that sent her pulse racing, his chest warm against her back as they rode toward the Silver Star. The main house of the ranch was ablaze with light. Lanterns hung from every available post. A large area had been cleared for dancing, with hay bales arranged for seating around the perimeter. A fiddler and banjo player were already setting up on a small platform, and tables laden with food lined one side of the improvised dance floor. As Blake helped Jillian dismount, she became uncomfortably aware of curious glances from the gathering townsfolk. Her usual interactions with them were limited to business, selling a horse, buying supplies, brief exchanges at church on Sundays. This was different. This was social. "Everyone's staring," she murmured as Blake guided her toward the festivities. "Let them," he replied, his hand warm at the small of her back. "They're just surprised to see the two most stubborn people in Alta found common ground." Despite her nervousness, Jillian found herself enjoying the evening. Blake introduced her to Silver Star hands she hadn't met, engaged her in conversation with Mitchell and his wife, and kept her plate filled with delicious food prepared by the ranch cook. When the music started, Blake extended his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Caldwell?" With only a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor. The fiddle struck up a lively reel, and soon they were moving together in perfect synchronicity. Blake was an excellent dancer, guiding her through the steps with the same confidence he showed in everything. "You lied," he said as they circled each other. "About what?" "About being out of practice." "You dance beautifully," Jillian laughed, the sound carrying over the music. "The partner makes all the difference." As the evening progressed, they danced every dance. Fast or slow, it didn't matter, they moved as if they'd been dancing together for years. During a particularly energetic polka, Jillian caught sight of Sarah Jenkins watching them with undisguised approval, and found she didn't mind the matchmaking as much as she might have before. The fiddler eventually slowed the pace, striking up a gentle waltz. Blake drew her closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. They moved in small circles, their steps perfectly matched. "Thank you for coming tonight," Blake said softly, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Thank you for asking me," Jillian replied. "I'm having a wonderful time." "Even with all the prying eyes," she smiled. "Even with those." Blake's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you." The seriousness in his voice made her heart skip. "What is it?" "The barn will be finished next week." Jillian blinked, surprised by the mundane statement. "Yes, I know. Once it's done, the men from Silver Star won't have a reason to come to your place every day." Understanding dawned. He was telling her that their daily visits would end. The thought created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. "I see," she said carefully. Blake guided her through a turn before continuing. "I was hoping I might still have a reason to visit." Jillian looked up into his face, reading the question in his eyes. "I think that could be arranged," she said softly. "The horses need checking on after all." A smile tugged at his mouth. "The horses, of course. And perhaps their owner might enjoy some company now and then." His smile widened. "Perhaps she might." They continued to waltz, the music weaving around them. But Jillian was conscious only of Blake, the solid strength of his arms, the warmth in his eyes, the way he held her as if she were something precious. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't solitary, a life shared rather than merely endured. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. As the night deepened and stars scattered across the velvet sky, the dance began to wind down. Families with children departed first, followed by older couples. The younger folks lingered, the unmarried men and women finding reasons to extend the rare social occasion. "Would you like to stay longer?" Blake asked as the fiddler began a new set. Jillian shook her head. "I should get back." "The horses need checking," Blake finished with a knowing smile. "Of course." The ride home was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. The night had turned cold, and Jillian was grateful for Blake's warmth behind her. When they reached her cabin, he helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said, reluctant for it to end. "The pleasure was mine." Blake hesitated, then added, "I'd like to call on you properly, Jillian, not just for barn building or horse checking." The directness of his statement sent a flutter through her stomach. "I'd like that," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Blake stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, he lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and over almost before it began. Yet it left Jillian breathless, her heart racing as if she'd run up the mountainside. "Good night, Jillian," Blake said softly, his voice deeper than usual. "Good night, Blake." She watched him ride away, her fingers touching her lips where the warmth of his kiss lingered. The night suddenly seemed full of possibility, and for the first time in a very long while, Jillian Caldwell looked forward to tomorrow. The autumn days grew shorter, the nights colder, but Jillian hardly noticed as she settled into a new rhythm of life. The barn was completed just before the first significant snowfall, sturdy and spacious, with improvements Blake had suggested that made her daily tasks easier. The horses took to their new home immediately, seeming to forget the trauma of the fire. True to his word, Blake called on her regularly. Sometimes they rode together, exploring the mountains around Alta. Other times they simply sat by the fire in her cabin, talking or reading companionably. Occasionally, he brought her into town for church or a community gathering, slowly easing her back into the social fabric she'd withdrawn from after her father's death. In turn, Jillian found herself opening up, sharing stories and dreams she'd kept locked away. She told him about her ambitions for the breeding program, her desire to produce horses that combined the Morgan's strength and intelligence with the speed and endurance needed for the demanding mountain terrain. Blake listened with genuine interest, offering suggestions and encouragement that made her plans seem more achievable. Winter descended on Alta with a vengeance in late November, burying the town in snow and making travel between outlying homesteads treacherous. Blake still made the journey from Silver Star to Jillian's place whenever the weather permitted, sometimes staying to help with chores made more difficult by the snow and ice. One particularly bitter December afternoon, a blizzard blew in unexpectedly while Blake was helping Jillian repair a leak in the barn roof. Within minutes, visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind howled around the buildings like a living thing. "You can't ride back to Silver Star in this," Jillian said as they secured the barn doors against the storm. "You'd freeze before you made it halfway." Blake nodded grimly. "Mitchell will know I got caught. He won't expect me until the storm breaks." They dashed through the swirling snow to the cabin, relief washing over them as they entered the warm interior. Jillian busied herself building up the fire while Blake shook snow from his coat and hat. "You're welcome to stay until it passes," she said, keeping her tone casual despite the implications of the offer. An unmarried woman hosting a man overnight would set tongues wagging in Alta, but the alternative, sending him out into a potentially deadly blizzard, was unthinkable. "Thank you," Blake said simply, helping her prepare a simple dinner of beans and salt pork. They ate by the fire, listening to the wind rattling the windows and howling down the chimney. Despite the storm's ferocity, Jillian felt a strange contentment in the cozy cabin with Blake across from her. They talked softly as the evening wore on, sharing stories from their childhoods and dreams for the future. "I never thought I'd stay in one place for long," Blake admitted as he helped her clear the dishes. "My pa moved us so often, I guess I got used to drifting." "And now?" Jillian asked, aware of a tightness in her chest as she awaited his answer. Blake met her eyes steadily. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." The simplicity of his statement and the depth of feeling behind it made her breath catch. She turned away, suddenly overwhelmed by emotions she'd been carefully containing. Blake's hand on her arm stopped her retreat. "Jillian," he said softly, "look at me." She did, finding his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what? Of this? Of us?" "Of wanting something I might lose." Understanding dawned in his expression. "Because you lost your father." She nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "Everyone I've ever loved has left me. My mother, my father. I learned it's safer not to need anyone." Blake's hands came up to frame her face, his calloused thumbs gently wiping away the tears that had escaped despite her efforts. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen," he said, his voice low and serious. "Life doesn't work that way, but I can promise I won't leave by choice, Jillian." "Not ever." She searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his steady gaze. Slowly, she raised her hand to cover his, turning her head slightly to press a kiss against his palm. Blake's breath caught audibly, and then he was drawing her closer, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that held none of the hesitation of their first. This kiss was certain, claiming, a declaration without words. Jillian responded with equal fervor, her arms twining around his neck as she pressed herself against him. Blake groaned softly, deepening the kiss as his arms encircled her waist. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Jillian Caldwell," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I have since the first time I saw you breaking that stubborn colt of Mitchell's that no one else could ride." Jillian laughed shakily. "You never told me that was the first time you saw me. You were magnificent. Fearless. I knew right then I'd found something special." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "It just took some time to convince you of the same." "I'm convinced," she whispered, pressing another quick kiss to his lips. "And I love you too, Blake Jamison, even if you are the most stubborn man I've ever met." He grinned, the expression boyish in its delight. "Coming from you, that's quite a compliment." The storm raged through the night, but inside the small cabin, Jillian and Blake created their own sanctuary of warmth and love. They talked until the fire burned low, exchanging kisses and promises, planning a future neither had imagined possible just months before. When exhaustion finally claimed them, Blake insisted on sleeping in the chair by the fire, respecting both Jillian's reputation and his own sense of propriety, despite the newfound intimacy between them. Jillian retired to her bed, falling asleep to the comforting knowledge that the man she loved was just across the room, watching over her as the blizzard howled outside. The next morning dawned blindingly bright, the storm having moved on during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Jillian awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Blake moving quietly around her small kitchen. "Morning," he greeted her with a smile that warmed her more effectively than the fire he'd rebuilt. "Storm's past. Roads will be clear enough by midday." Jillian nodded, suddenly shy in the light of day, unsure how to navigate this new territory between them. Blake seemed to sense her uncertainty, keeping a respectful distance as they shared breakfast, and then tackled the chores made necessary by the storm. They worked in companionable silence, clearing paths to the barn and making sure the horses had water that wasn't frozen. The physical labor was familiar and comforting, helping Jillian settle her thoughts about the dramatic shift in their relationship. By the time they returned to the cabin, cheeks red from exertion and cold, Jillian had made a decision. As Blake removed his snow-covered gloves, she took a deep breath and spoke the words she'd been considering all morning. "I think you should speak to Reverend Adams when you get back to town." Blake looked up, confusion evident in his expression. "About what?" "About publishing the bands." Understanding dawned slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jillian Caldwell?" She lifted her chin, a hint of her usual stubbornness returning. "Someone has to move things along. At the rate you're going, we'll be gray-haired before you get around to it." Blake laughed, a rich sound that filled the cabin. In 2 strides he crossed to her and swept her into his arms. "Yes," he said, punctuating the word with a kiss. "Yes, I will marry you." Jillian's laughter joined his, relief and happiness bubbling up inside her. "Good. Because I've grown rather fond of having you around, Jamison." "Is that so?" he murmured, kissing her again more thoroughly. When they separated, both breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you, though. I was planning to ask properly, with a ring and everything, at Christmas." "Oh," Jillian bit her lip, suddenly contrite. "I've spoiled your surprise." Blake shook his head, smiling. "You've just given me a better story to tell our grandchildren someday." How their grandmother was too impatient to wait for me to propose properly. The mention of grandchildren, the implication of a long life together, of family and future, filled Jillian with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "I'm sure they'll find it very amusing," she said softly. "I'm sure they will." Blake kissed her once more, then reluctantly stepped back. "I should get back to Silver Star. Mitchell will be wondering if I've been buried in a snowdrift." Jillian nodded, though she was loath to see him go. "Will you come back tomorrow? Wild horses couldn't keep me away." He grinned. "Or perhaps I should say, only wild horses could lure me away." She laughed, helping him into his coat and walking him to the door. Outside, the world was transformed into a glittering white paradise, the sun reflecting blindingly off the pristine snow. Blake's horse nickered from the barn, eager to be on the move after the confinement of the storm. "I love you," Blake said, drawing her close for one more kiss. Mrs. Jamison to be. I love you too, Jillian replied, savoring the words she'd never thought she'd say again after losing her father. Ride safe. She watched him saddle up and ride away, his figure gradually diminishing against the white landscape. But unlike before, there was no melancholy in watching him go, only anticipation for his return and the life they would build together. News of their engagement spread through Alta with the speed of a mountain wildfire. Sarah Jenkins was the first to visit, bringing a basket of preserves and unabashed curiosity. I knew it, she declared triumphantly, settling at Jillian's table. From the moment he carried you out of that burning barn, I told Harold you two were destined for each other. Jillian blinked in confusion. Blake didn't carry me out of the barn. I was already outside when he arrived. He went in and saved my horses. Sarah waved away the correction. Details. The point is, that man has been smitten from the start. Half the single women in town have been throwing themselves at him for months, and he's only had eyes for you. She patted Jillian's hand. I'm so happy for you, dear. When's the wedding to be? We haven't set a date yet, Jillian admitted. But soon. Before spring, certainly. Sarah nodded approvingly. A winter wedding. How romantic. We'll have to start planning right away. Before Jillian could protest that she'd envisioned something simple, Sarah was already discussing dresses and cakes and decorations with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign. By the time she left, Jillian's head was spinning with details she hadn't considered. Blake arrived that evening to find her surrounded by lists and looking somewhat overwhelmed. Sarah Jenkins was here, she explained as he hung up his coat. Ah, he said, understanding immediately. And now we're having the wedding of the century, Jillian laughed, relief flooding through her that he understood. Something like that. I tried to tell her we wanted something small, but Sarah is a force of nature, Blake finished, sitting beside her and examining the lists with amusement. Dancing bears, imported flowers, a cake taller than you, she means well. She does. Blake took Jillian's hand, his expression turning serious. What do you want, Jillian? Not what Sarah wants or what the town expects. What would make you happy? Jillian considered the question, realizing no one had asked her that in a very long time. Something simple, she said finally. With people who truly care about us, not just those who want to be part of a spectacle. And soon. I don't want to wait months for some elaborate affair. Blake nodded, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. That sounds perfect to me. How about New Year's Day? Start the year as husband and wife. The suggestion resonated with rightness. Yes, Jillian said, squeezing his hand. New Year's Day. With the date decided, preparations began in earnest. Despite Sarah's grand visions, Jillian insisted on simplicity. The ceremony would take place in the small church in Alta, followed by a celebration at Silver Star, which Mitchell had generously offered when he heard of their plans. December passed in a blur of preparations and increasingly frequent snowstorms. Blake divided his time between his duties at Silver Star and helping Jillian prepare her place for the changes marriage would bring. They decided he would move to her cabin, which was smaller than the foreman's quarters at Silver Star, but offered privacy and the promise of expansion in the spring. Mitchell, understanding the value of Blake's new family connections and Jillian's horse-breeding expertise, had readily agreed to the arrangement, even offering Blake a partnership in a new venture breeding cavalry mounts for the army. Christmas arrived with another heavy snowfall, transforming Alta into a picture-perfect winter scene. Blake and Jillian exchanged simple gifts, a new saddle blanket she had embroidered for him, a delicate silver locket containing a lock of her mother's hair that he had commissioned from a silversmith in Salt Lake City. Despite her earlier proposal, Blake insisted on formally asking for her hand, presenting her with a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "It's perfect," Jillian whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. "Just perfect." New Year's Eve brought unexpected clear skies and milder temperatures. Blake spent the day at Silver Star, completing his duties before the holiday, while Jillian welcomed her soon-to-be mother-in-law and sister, who had traveled from Missouri for the wedding. Mary Jamison was a sturdy woman in her 50s. Her once dark hair now liberally streaked with gray, but her blue eyes so like Blake's bright with intelligence and warmth. Elizabeth, at 19, was a feminine version of her brother, with the same straight nose and determined chin, though her hair was a lighter brown. "He wrote so much about you in his letters. I feel I know you already," Mary said, embracing Jillian warmly. "My son has excellent taste." "Blake speaks of you often," Jillian replied, genuinely pleased with her future mother-in-law's obvious approval. "I'm so glad you could come." "Wild horses couldn't have kept us away," Elizabeth declared, unconsciously echoing her brother's favorite phrase. "Though the train journey was quite an adventure. I've never seen such mountains." They spent the day getting acquainted, Mary and Elizabeth helping Jillian with final preparations for the wedding. By evening, the small cabin was filled with the sense of baking and the sounds of feminine laughter, a novel experience for Jillian, who had grown up in a household of men. As night fell, Blake arrived to escort his mother and sister to their lodgings at the hotel in town. The women would return in the morning to help Jillian dress for the ceremony, while Blake would prepare at Silver Star, respecting the tradition that the groom shouldn't see the bride before the wedding. "This time tomorrow, you'll be Mrs. Jamison," he murmured, stealing a moment alone with Jillian before departing. "And you'll be stuck with the most stubborn woman in Alta," she replied, her arms around his neck. Blake grinned. "I consider that the greatest fortune a man could have." He kissed her thoroughly, then reluctantly pulled away. "Until tomorrow, my love." Jillian slept poorly that night, a combination of excitement and nerves keeping her restless. She rose before dawn, watching the first light of the new year creep across the snow-covered landscape from her window. Today, she would marry Blake Jamison. The thought filled her with a joy so intense it was almost painful. Mary and Elizabeth arrived shortly after sunrise, bringing with them Sarah Jenkins and a basket laden with breakfast treats. The women transformed the small cabin into a bridal preparation area, helping Jillian bathe and dress with a mixture of practical advice and sentimental reminiscences. "My mother's dress fit you perfectly with just those small adjustments," Mary said, tears glistening in her eyes as she fastened the final button on the high-necked gown of ivory satin and lace. "She would have been so proud to see you wearing it." Jillian touched the delicate fabric reverently. "Thank you for sharing it with me. It means so much." Sarah arranged Jillian's hair, weaving sprigs of winter greenery and small white flowers into the auburn waves. Elizabeth contributed a pair of pearl earrings borrowed from Mother, for luck, while Mary presented her with a blue ribbon to tie around her bouquet of dried flowers and evergreen. "Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue," Sarah recited with satisfaction. "You're ready, my dear." Jillian studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who looked back at her was transformed not just by the elegant dress and carefully arranged hair, but by the happiness that seemed to illuminate her from within. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Edward Mitchell, who had offered to escort Jillian to the church in the absence of her father. The older man's eyes widened appreciatively when she emerged from the bedroom. "Blake Jamison is a fortunate man," he said, offering his arm. "You look radiant, Miss Caldwell." The women bundled Jillian into a fur-lined cloak for the journey to town, the men having cleared the roads the previous day to ensure passage for the wedding party. Mitchell had brought his finest sleigh, the horses adorned with bells that jingled merrily as they glided over the packed snow. Alta's small church was filled to capacity when they arrived, the townsfolk having turned out in force despite the cold. Jillian paused at the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed by the sea of faces turned expectantly toward her. Then the crowd parted, and she saw Blake standing at the altar, tall and handsome in a new black suit, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that everything else faded away. With Mitchell's steady support, she moved down the aisle to the strains of a hymn played on the church's small organ. Blake stepped forward to meet her, taking her hand as Mitchell placed it in his with a formal nod. "You're breathtaking," Blake whispered as they turned to face Reverend Adams. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and confident in the hushed church. When Blake slipped the simple gold band onto her finger alongside the engagement ring, Jillian felt a sense of rightness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Adams declared, his voice carrying to the rafters. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Blake didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. Drawing her close, he claimed her lips in a kiss that managed to be both reverent and passionate, eliciting cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the congregation. "Mrs. Jamison," he murmured against her lips when they finally parted. "Mr. Jamison," she replied, her smile matching his. The celebration at Silver Star was everything Jillian had hoped for: warm, joyful, and filled with people who genuinely cared for them. Mitchell had transformed the ranch's great room into a festive space, with greenery and ribbons adorning the walls and tables laden with food and drink. The fiddler from the harvest dance provided music, and soon the floor was filled with dancing couples. Blake and Jillian moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes. To Jillian's surprise, many of the townspeople she had considered merely acquaintances expressed genuine happiness for her, making her realize she had more friends in Alta than she'd thought. "You look happy," Blake said as they finally claimed a moment alone, stepping outside onto the porch to catch their breath from the dancing and heat inside. "I am happy," Jillian replied, leaning against him as they looked out at the snow-covered landscape, silver in the moonlight. "Happier than I ever thought possible." Blake wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Good, because making you happy is my new life's mission." She turned in his embrace to face him. "You already do, every day." As they shared another kiss under the vast starry sky, Jillian marveled at how drastically her life had changed in just a few months. From the terror of the barn fire to the joy of this moment, the journey had been unexpected but perfect in its way. Blake had not only saved her horses that night, he had awakened her heart from the slumber of grief and loneliness, showing her that love was worth the risk of loss. Later, as they drove back to what was now their home, the bells on the sleigh jingling through the quiet night, Jillian rested her head on her husband's shoulder, contentment flowing through her veins like warm honey. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, a new year and a new life beginning together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jamison," Blake said as he carried her across the threshold of the cabin, now decorated with touches of greenery and candles courtesy of Mary and Elizabeth. "Home," Jillian repeated, the word filled with new meaning. "Our home." Blake set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. "The first of many, if you like. We could build something larger in the spring," or she silenced him with a kiss. "This is perfect for now." We have all the time in the world to plan the rest." As Blake deepened the kiss, leading her toward the bedroom with gentle insistence, Jillian surrendered to the love that had found her when she least expected it, grateful for a fire that had destroyed a barn but built a future more beautiful than she had dared to dream. Spring came to Alta in a riot of wildflowers and melting snow, turning the mountain streams into rushing torrents and the hillsides into carpets of green. For Blake and Jillian, the months since their New Year's wedding had been a time of adjustment and discovery, learning to blend two independent lives into one shared existence. They had expanded the breeding operation, Blake's connections through Silver Star bringing new clients and opportunities. Jillian's expertise combined with Blake's business acumen proved a formidable combination, and by May, they had a waiting list for foals not yet born. On a particularly fine morning in late May, Jillian stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching Blake work with a spirited 2-year-old colt in the corral. His patience with the animal was endless, his movements confident but gentle as he guided the young horse through basic commands. The sight still made her heart beat faster, even after months of marriage. "That colt's going to be something special," she called, walking toward the fence. "Mitchell's going to regret letting us have him." Blake grinned, patting the dun-colored horse before exiting the corral. "Mitchell knows we'll give him first pick of the offspring." He pulled off his gloves, tucking them into his belt. "Besides, he's too busy with that new silver strike to worry about one colt." The discovery of a rich silver vein in the mountains above Alta the previous month had brought a fresh influx of miners and fortune seekers to the town. The population had nearly doubled, bringing both prosperity and challenges to the once quiet settlement. "Speaking of Mitchell," Blake continued, "he wants us to join him and Margaret for dinner tonight. Something about a proposition he wants to discuss." Jillian raised an eyebrow. "What kind of proposition?" He didn't say, just that it could mean good things for our breeding program. She nodded thoughtfully. "I'll wear my blue dress then. Margaret always appreciates a bit of effort." Blake grinned, pulling her close for a quick kiss. "You'd look beautiful in a feed sack, but the blue dress is my favorite." Jillian laughed, swatting him playfully. "Flatterer. Now let me go so I can get some work done before we have to leave for town." The Mitchells' home on the outskirts of Alta was a substantial 2-story structure, reflecting Edward's success as a rancher and, increasingly, as an investor in mining operations. Margaret Mitchell, a diminutive woman with shrewd eyes and impeccable manners, welcomed them warmly. "Jillian, you're positively glowing," she exclaimed, embracing the younger woman. "Married life clearly agrees with you." "It does," Jillian agreed, exchanging a smile with Blake. "Though I never expected to be quite so busy. Between the horses and the house and Blake's endless projects, there aren't enough hours in the day." "That's precisely what Edward wants to discuss," Margaret said, leading them to the parlor where her husband was pouring drinks. "He's been plotting and planning for weeks." Edward greeted them with his usual bonhomie, handing Blake a glass of whiskey and offering Jillian her choice of sherry or lemonade. Once they were seated, he wasted no time getting to the point. "The Army's looking for reliable suppliers of cavalry mounts," he announced. "With the troubles down south and expansion westward, they need more horses than they can currently source. Good horses, not the broken-down nags some suppliers have been passing off." Blake leaned forward, instantly interested. "How many are they looking for?" "Hundreds, eventually, but they'll start with smaller orders to test quality." Edward swirled his whiskey. "I've been corresponding with a colonel I served with during the war. He's in procurement now, and he's willing to give us first consideration if we can demonstrate we have the stock and capacity." "Us?" Jillian questioned. Silver Star in partnership with Caldwell Jamison Breeding, Edward clarified. Your bloodlines combined with our grazing land and capital for expansion. Blake and Jillian exchanged a glance, silently communicating as they'd learned to do in their months together. We'd need to increase our brood mares significantly, Jillian said thoughtfully, and acquire at least one more stallion for diversity. And build larger facilities, Blake added. The new barn is fine for our current operation, but for this scale. Edward nodded, clearly having anticipated these concerns. I've had some preliminary plans drawn up. A new stable complex on the eastern section of Silver Star property, with direct access to your land. Shared pasturage. A formal business partnership with profit sharing based on contribution. He unrolled a map on the coffee table, showing the proposed development. The scale was impressive, far larger than anything Jillian had envisioned for their modest breeding program. This would be a significant undertaking, she said, studying the plans. We'd need to hire hands, a stable manager perhaps. And the initial investment would be substantial, Blake noted, looking to Edward. What kind of capital are you proposing to put in? Edward named a figure that made both Blake and Jillian blink in surprise. The silver strike has been good to me, he said with a slight smile. And I believe in diversifying investments. The conversation continued through dinner, with Edward outlining his vision and Blake and Jillian raising questions and suggestions. By the time dessert was served, Margaret's famous apple pie, the broad strokes of an agreement had been reached. We'll need to review the formal contract, of course, Blake said as they prepared to leave, but I think we're in agreement on the essentials. Edward clasped his hand firmly. Excellent. I'll have the papers drawn up this week. As they drove home through the cool spring night, Jillian was quiet, processing the enormity of what they had just agreed to. Having second thoughts? Blake asked. Noting her silence, she shook her head. Not second thoughts exactly, just, it's a big step. Bigger than anything I imagined when Pa and I were breeding a few horses a year. Too big. His voice held no judgment, only a genuine question. Jillian considered this, then smiled slowly. No, not too big, just big enough to be exciting. Blake grinned, pulling her closer against his side on the wagon seat. That's my girl, always ready for the next challenge. Our challenge, she corrected. I couldn't do this without you, Blake, wouldn't want to. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Partners in all things, Mrs. Jamison, always. The partnership with Silver Star transformed their operation virtually overnight. Construction began on the new facilities within weeks, and Blake made a trip to Kentucky to purchase additional breeding stock, returning with 6 prime mares and a magnificent black stallion that complemented Thunder's bloodlines perfectly. Jillian found herself busier than she'd ever been, overseeing the horse care while Blake managed construction and business negotiations. They hired 3 experienced hands to help with the expanded operation, and by midsummer, the new stables were taking shape on the boundary between their property and Silver Star. On a sweltering August afternoon, Jillian was reviewing the week's training schedule when a wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the edge of the desk, taking deep breaths until the sensation passed. It was the 3rd such episode that week, and Blake's concerned glances told her he'd noticed. Perhaps you should see Doc Harris, he suggested that evening as they sat on the porch, enjoying the relative cool of twilight. You've been working too hard in this heat. Jillian sipped her lemonade, considering how to share her suspicions. I don't think it's the heat, Blake. He turned to her, brow furrowed. Are you ill? No. She set her glass down, taking his hand. I think I might be expecting. Blake's expression transformed from concern to wonder in an instant. A baby, our baby, Jillian nodded, her own face breaking into a smile at his reaction. I'm not certain yet, but it's been 2 months since. Well, you know. 2 months, Blake repeated, calculations visibly running behind his eyes. So perhaps February or March, if I'm right, yes. Blake let out a whoop of joy, pulling her from her chair into his lap and kissing her soundly. A baby, he murmured against her lips. Jillian, this is wonderful news. His unabashed delight eased the anxiety she'd been feeling. At 24, Jillian had begun to wonder if motherhood would ever be part of her future. The possibility that it might now be a reality filled her with both excitement and trepidation. You're happy, then? She asked, needing the reassurance. Blake looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. Happy, Jillian, I'm ecstatic, overjoyed, delirious with happiness. He touched her still flat stomach with reverence. A child, our child. We should wait for Doc Harris to confirm it before we tell anyone, she cautioned. Of course, Blake agreed, though his grin suggested keeping the secret would be a challenge. But tomorrow, first thing, we're going to see him. Dr. Harris confirmed Jillian's suspicions the next day, estimating the baby would arrive in late February. Everything appears normal, he assured them. But you'll need to start taking things easier, Mrs. Jamison. No more breaking wild colts or lifting heavy loads. Blake nodded emphatically. I'll make sure of it, Doc. Jillian rolled her eyes at her husband's protective tone but secretly appreciated his concern. I'll be sensible, she promised, but I can't just sit idle for 7 months. No one expects you to, the doctor said with a smile. Just use common sense. Listen to your body when it tells you to rest. They kept the news private for another month, wanting to be certain all was well before sharing their joy. When they finally told Edward and Margaret Mitchell at Sunday dinner in September, the older couple's delight was almost as great as their own. A baby, Margaret exclaimed, embracing Jillian warmly. Oh, my dear, what wonderful news. We must start planning the nursery immediately. Edward clapped Blake on the shoulder, his weathered face creased in a broad smile. Congratulations, my boy. Fatherhood is the greatest adventure of all. As word spread through Alta, Jillian was touched by the community's response. Women who had barely spoken to her before now stopped to offer advice and congratulations. Sarah Jenkins organized a sewing circle to create baby clothes and blankets. Even the gruffest miners tipped their hats respectfully when she passed, as if her impending motherhood had conferred a special status. The months passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. The business partnership with Silver Star flourished, with the first Army contracts secured by Christmas. Blake insisted on hiring additional help as Jillian's pregnancy progressed, allowing her to focus on the breeding decisions and record-keeping she could do from home. By January, the new stables were complete, a magnificent structure that could house 50 horses comfortably. The first Army inspection had gone flawlessly, with Colonel Harrison praising the quality of their stock and placing an initial order for 20 mounts with the promise of more to follow. We did it, Blake said as they stood together in the snow, watching the soldiers depart with the carefully selected horses. Everything we talked about last spring is happening. Jillian leaned against him, her hand resting on her rounded belly where their child grew stronger each day. We did, she agreed, though I think you and Edward had more faith than I did at the beginning. Blake placed his hand over hers, both of them smiling as they felt a decisive kick from within. This little one will be born into something special, he said, a legacy your father would be proud of. The reminder of her father brought both sadness and comfort. He would have loved all of this, she said softly. Especially you. I wish I could have known him better, Blake replied. But I see him in you every day, your determination, your integrity, your way with horses. Jillian blinked back tears, pregnancy having made her more emotional than usual. He used to say the right person comes into your life exactly when you need them, even if you don't realize it at the time. "Wise man, your father," Blake murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though in our case, I think it took a burning barn to make you realize you needed me." Jillian laughed, the sound bright in the crisp winter air. "Perhaps, or perhaps I just needed to be ready to let someone in again." They walked back to the cabin arm in arm, the future stretching before them filled with promise and possibility. The business was thriving, their love deeper than ever, and soon their family would grow by one more. For Jillian, who had once feared she would spend her life alone, it was more happiness than she had dared to dream possible. Benjamin Thomas Jamison arrived on a snowy February morning after a long, difficult labor. Weighing 9 pounds and blessed with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined spirit, he announced his presence with lusty cries that echoed through the cabin. "He's perfect," Blake whispered, cradling his son with awe and trepidation after the midwife had cleaned and swaddled the infant. "Absolutely perfect." Exhausted but radiant, Jillian watched her husband and son together, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "He has your chin," she observed. "Poor boy." Blake grinned, gently placing the baby in her arms. "And your stubbornness, I'd wager." 10 hours of labor, and he still wasn't ready to join us. "Just making an entrance worthy of a Jamison," she replied, brushing a finger over the downy hair on Benjamin's head. "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." The baby blinked up at her with unfocused blue eyes, his tiny hand wrapping around her finger with surprising strength. In that moment, Jillian felt a new kind of love unfold within her, fierce, protective, and all-encompassing. "Thank you," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion as he sat beside them on the bed. "For our son, for our life together." Jillian looked up at her husband, seeing in his face the same wonder and love she felt. "Thank you for running into a burning barn," she said softly. "For being brave enough to risk everything for what matters." "Best decision I ever made," Blake replied, leaning down to kiss her gently. "Though loving you was even easier." As Benjamin drifted to sleep in her arms, Jillian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the terror of the fire to the joy of this new life, every step had led them exactly where they were meant to be. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes: a love, a family, a future brighter than either could have imagined alone. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Alta in pristine white, while inside the cozy cabin, a new family found its beginning. The horses in the new barn stamped and whickered softly. The business contracts lay signed and sealed in Blake's desk drawer, and Benjamin Thomas Jamison slept peacefully in his mother's arms, unaware of the legacy he had been born into or the love that surrounded him. For Blake and Jillian, it was everything they had ever wanted and more than they had dared to hope for: a love kindled in fire, tempered by challenges, and now blessed with new life. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, partners in all things. Their bond forged in the heat of a burning barn and strengthened with each passing day. As twilight deepened into night, Blake lit the lamps and stoked the fire, the familiar tasks grounding him in the extraordinary new reality of fatherhood. Returning to the bedroom, he found Jillian humming softly to Benjamin, the ancient lullaby her own father had once sung to her. "I love you," Blake said simply, the words inadequate to express the depth of his feelings but all he had to offer. Jillian looked up, her smile tired but radiant. "I love you too, both of you." In that moment, in the golden lamplight of a snowy February evening, they were complete: a family born from courage, nurtured by love, and bound by the promise of all that was yet to come. 10 years passed, each season bringing new challenges and joys to the Jamison family. The partnership with Silver Star had expanded beyond their original expectations, with cavalry contracts across the Western Territories and a reputation for producing some of the finest horses in the region. Blake and Jillian had built a larger home on their property, a comfortable two-story structure that overlooked both the original cabin, now converted to an office, and the extensive stables and training facilities. Benjamin, now a sturdy 10-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick mind, had been joined by 7-year-old twins, Abigail and Andrew, both with auburn hair like Jillian's and Blake's steady temperament. All three children showed the same natural affinity for horses that had brought their parents together, though Benjamin in particular seemed destined to follow in their footsteps, already showing a remarkable ability to gentle the most skittish colt. On a crisp autumn morning much like the one when their story had begun, Jillian stood on the porch of their home, watching as Blake and Benjamin worked with a promising young mare in the training ring. The scene brought a smile to her face, her tall, still handsome husband patiently demonstrating a technique to their son, who mimicked his movements with serious concentration. "Mama, look what we found." Abigail's voice broke into her reverie as the twins raced around the corner of the house, their hands cupped carefully around some treasure. Jillian knelt to their level, admiring the tiny frog they'd discovered near the creek. "He's a handsome fellow," she said, gently touching its mottled back. "But I think he'd be happier back by the water, don't you?" Andrew nodded solemnly. "We just wanted to show you first. We'll take him home." "Good plan." She ruffled his hair affectionately. "Then wash up for lunch. Your Grandma Mary will be arriving on the afternoon train and we need to be ready." The twins scampered off, their heads bent together in conversation, as they carefully transported their amphibian friend. Jillian straightened, her hand automatically going to the small of her back where an ache had developed in recent weeks, the first sign of the child they were expecting in early spring. Blake had spotted her on the porch and was now walking toward her, leaving Benjamin to continue working with the mare under the watchful eye of Thomas, their head trainer. Even after a decade of marriage, the sight of her husband still made Jillian's heart beat faster. The years had added a few lines around his eyes and a touch of silver at his temples, but he moved with the same fluid grace and confidence she'd first admired. "How are my girls this morning?" he asked, pulling her into a gentle embrace and placing a hand on her still flat stomach. They'd only recently confirmed she was expecting again, and Blake was convinced this one would be another daughter. "We're fine," Jillian replied, leaning into his strength. "Though your son is convinced it's another boy, he and the twins had quite the debate at breakfast." Blake chuckled. "As long as he or she is healthy, I'll be happy." He kissed her temple. "You're not overdoing it, are you? Mother will have my hide if she arrives to find you exhausted." Jillian rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "I'm pregnant, not invalid, and your mother knows better than to fuss." "She raised you after all." "True enough," Blake conceded. "Though she claims I was never as stubborn as you." "A diplomatic lie to spare your feelings," Jillian teased, earning a laugh and another kiss. They stood together for a moment, watching Benjamin with pride as he successfully guided the young mare through a figure-8 pattern. In the distance, the twins could be seen returning from the creek, hand in hand as they always seemed to be. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is our life," Blake said softly. "Remember that night with the barn burning and the horses trapped?" Jillian nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "How could I forget? You nearly got yourself killed playing hero." "Best decision I ever made," he replied, echoing words he'd spoken many times over the years. "Though I seem to recall it took more than that to convince you I was worth keeping around." She laughed, the sound carrying across the yard and making Benjamin look up and wave. "You were persistent, I'll give you that. Had to be. Knew a good thing when I saw it." Blake's arm tightened around her waist. "Still do." As they watched their children, Benjamin, now dismounting with a satisfied expression, the twins racing to tell him about their frog discovery, Jillian felt the familiar wave of gratitude that often overtook her in quiet moments. From the ashes of that burning barn, they had built this life together, a thriving business, a loving family, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. "I love you, Blake Jamison," she said simply, turning in his arms to face him. "More than I ever thought possible." Blake's blue eyes, still as bright and clear as the day they'd met, crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. "And I love you, Jillian Jamison, more with each passing day." As their lips met in a kiss that held all the passion of their youth and all the depth of their shared years, their children's laughter rang out around them, the sweetest music either could imagine. From terror and flame had come this abundance of joy, this life fuller and richer than dreams could conjure. It was, they both knew, only the beginning.